About 2 years ago now, I made a video detailing 30 must-read Japanese books in translation. A lot has changed since then, and I've read at least 20 more, both new books that have come out recently and old Japanese classics. So it's time to revisit that. Here are 20 more must-read Japanese books in translation. If you enjoy this and you want to have a say in what videos I put out next, you can join my Patreon. Here's a classic Japanese thriller, a wonderful murder mystery that's about 100 years old, which I read relatively recently and absolutely adored. This is Beast in the Shadows by Edogawa Rampo, whose name is a partial anagram of Edgar Allan Poe, which is really cool. This was translated into English by Ian Hughes, and it's kind of a piece of metafiction to a point, in the sense that our protagonist is an author of murder mystery stories. By chance, he meets this lovely young woman at a museum, and the two of them get to talking. They agree to exchange letters, and eventually, when she feels like she knows him well enough, she confesses something to him, which is that she's being stalked. She was being stalked when she was a teenager, and eventually she got married and the stalker gave up, but now he's back. Not only that, but she alleges that this stalker of hers is another author of murder mysteries that our protagonist absolutely hates. So our protagonist plays the part of a sleuth. That's his job, is to write about sleuths, write about detectives and mysteries and things like stalkers, but now he's wrapped up in it himself. And he doesn't know the stalker personally, but they are professional enemies, if you like. It seems pretty simple. We've got a potential victim, we've got a detective who's really a fiction writer playing a detective, and we know who the villain is, right? It should be pretty simple. They just need to catch him in a game of cat and mouse, but it's far from that simple. And this book is only about 90 pages long. It's absolutely tiny. I read it in a morning and I really enjoyed it. This is Fingerbone by Hiroki Takahashi. It was translated by Takumi Nieda, who is an incredible Japanese translator. And this is the best war novel I think I've ever read. It's a short literary novel told from the perspective of a nameless Japanese soldier in the jungle of Papua New Guinea. About half the novel is set in a war hospital where he's recovering from bullet wounds and people have been getting malaria and getting sick. And the other half is him out in the jungle. He makes friends and comrades, and he has to say goodbye to them. They keep dying because this is war. This is another classic war novel told from the perspective of a soldier at the front lines who is watching people he learns to befriend and even love die of not just their wounds, but of disease and exposure, just like the poet Wilfred Owen often talked about in his war poetry. If you're a fan of war stories, and I would say in particular a fan of the war poetry of Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon, you'll get a lot out of this. And we also don't get a lot of war stories told from a Japanese perspective, so that in itself is pretty valuable, but this really is a beautiful book about the chaos and pain of war, about the fact that nations treat people like nameless pawns, just meat for the grinder, and this reminds us that that meat is people. It's harsh and cruel and inarguably beautiful. While I was gathering up all the books to do this list, I couldn't find my copy of Diary of a Void. I don't know where I put it. I'm very annoyed. I think I must have lent it to someone, and if it was you, give it back. Anyway, Diary of a Void is one of my favourite Japanese novels. It was written by Emi Yagi, and it was translated into English by Lucy North and David Boyd. It's a brilliant feminist story about a woman who works at an office full of men and they treat her like a dog's body. She's the woman who gets tea and coffee for the men in this disgusting patriarchal system. One day she snaps. She decides she's had enough of being the dog's body, and the only thing that she can think to do in the moment is tell someone that she won't make coffee anymore because the smell makes her feel nauseous because she's pregnant. She's not pregnant, but she realizes very quickly that this lie changes how everyone sees her colleagues, her friends and family, and society at large. As long as she pretends to be pregnant, she's treated like she's valuable. Women are treated differently depending on what function they fulfill within society. That's kind of the point of the book. If she pretends to be pregnant, people suddenly treat her like she's actually worth something. The men treat her nicely rather than forcing her to treat them nicely. They do things for her rather than her having to do things for them. But she's not pregnant, and she can't keep up this lie forever. I absolutely adore Diary of a Void. It's such a great book. I did a video review you can go watch in case you want to learn more. I also reviewed Fingerbone. check that out as well. Yoko Ogawa is one of my top 3 favorite Japanese authors, and in my last video, I talked about her novel The Memory Police. The next time I do this, and there will be a next time, I will talk about a different book of hers. This time I'm talking about The Diving Pool. This is a collection of 3 short stories, novellas, not really sure. And depending on what you've read from her, you can often be surprised by just how dark and twisted and strange her mind can be. In a wonderful way, obviously, and this is a great example of that. One of the stories in here is about a girl who is the only biological child of her parents. The rest of them are all fostered. That's something her parents do. They basically run a foster home. And the oldest boy, the one who is closest to her in age, is growing up and she's starting to have feelings for him, and she sneakily watches him go diving at the local pool. She sits there and watches him and just admires his body, admires his form. Another story in here that hit me really hard as someone who never wants to have children and gets kind of scared of kids and pregnancy and all of that stuff is the tale of a young woman who is writing a diary about her sister's pregnancy and the ways in which she finds the pregnancy disgusting. She's just noting down details about this pregnancy that freak her out. She sees the baby as a parasite. She is disgusted by pregnancy as a thing. And this is something that I related to. Ogawa continues to surprise me with every new book of hers that I read. I love everything that she does. She has such a breadth of imagination and strangeness to her. If you've never read her, she's amazing. A classic Japanese book that I read a little while ago was Osamu Dazai's No Longer Human. This is a bleak book, so be warned. I got drunk to read and review it. The version that I read was translated by Donald Keene, but I think there are a few different translations of it. Osamu Dazai was a really tragic person, and he was not a wholly good guy at all, but he took his own life. And No Longer Human is often seen as kind of a suicide note as a novel. It's a piece of autofiction that is, by its nature, inspired by his own life. And it basically tells the story of someone who never fit into society for various reasons. We follow this guy's life until it ends, and he kind of sees himself as a monster, as someone who cannot play the role of a human anymore. If you've read the works of Sayaka Murata, it kind of feels like she is taking up his mantle sometimes. The two of them are writing stories about what not being able to fit into society can lead to. And for him, it led to death. And that's what he was also writing about in No Longer Human. It's not an easy book to read. His life is not an easy life to try and read about or understand, but it is worthwhile if you can stomach it, if you can deal with that kind of a thing. Speaking of Sayaka Murata, in my last video I talked about Convenience Store Woman, translated by Jinitapli Takimori, which is one of my favourite books of all time. I recently reread it and had an absolute blast. And here are her other 2 books that are currently available in English translation. At this point, Earthlings is kind of a legendary book. It's a book that you either love or hate. I love it. It is incredible, it is dark, it is daring, it is dreadfully upsetting. A lot of people call it a horror novel, and as a horror fan, I never have. Not really sure why though, because it is terrifying, it is twisted, and it is frightening, but I've never thought to categorize it as horror. Whatever. Earthlings, again, is a story about not fitting into society, but it's a lot more than that. We follow our protagonist as she grows up. In the early chapters, she is a child, up in the mountains in this cabin with her family that they own and they sometimes all go and meet up at. And she does things with her cousin. That's as much as I can say. And we follow her as she grows up and she experiences a lot of really traumatic, horrible things. She gets married and she has understood her entire life that she is not built for society. She believes that she's an alien or magic. She doesn't feel human. Society doesn't make sense to her, and she describes society as a factory. I love this book. It's time for a reread. I reviewed it 2 years ago, 3 years ago? God. Check out my review. I poured a lot into that review back then, but I do look quite different. Anyway, Murata's incredible. She's definitely not for everyone, but she's absolutely for me. And then we have Life Ceremony. This is a collection of short stories, which I believe she wrote before Earthlings, and I say that because there are stories in here that kind of feel like prototypes for Earthlings. There's a story in here that is basically Earthlings, and every story in here is about society in some way, and there's kind of a recurring theme where protagonists are either in the real world but they don't fit into society, or it's in an alternate world where society acts really, really strangely in a way that we would see as disgusting or depraved, and a protagonist in that story agrees with how we would feel. Imagine, for example, you live in a society where it's normal to eat someone after they die, in a kind of life ceremony. But one person believes that that should be taboo and it is disgusting, and everyone around them thinks they're the freak. This book does a lot of inversion of societal norms as a way to make some very obvious points. It is gratuitous and disgusting and wonderful, just like everything else she writes, and I love it. Let's raise the tone just a little bit with What You Are Looking For Is in the Library. This was written by Michiko Aoyama and it was translated into English by Alison Watts. I read this book really recently and I was so surprised by the lack of twee. This is a very, very heartfelt, grounded and beautiful book. I thought it was going to be a little bit shallow and it really, really isn't. It's a collection of 5 interlinked, interconnected short stories about 5 people who all eventually make their way to this local library in a Tokyo suburb. And the librarian there gives them what they need. Each of these 5 people are very different. There are 2 women and 3 men, I think. They're all at different stages of their life, they're different ages, they have different jobs, maybe one of them is a student, one of them is unemployed. They're all different, but they're all lost. And they need something. They need to figure out what their path forward is to get unstuck. And she manages to find what they need. That's kind of a gift that she has. She gives them a stack of books that they've come in to ask for, and 1 extra book that has nothing to do with anything that could possibly relate to them, and yet it provides them with what they need to get unstuck. It is absolutely beautiful. Another beautiful book that I read back in lockdown in 2020 is The Forest of Wool and Steel. This was written by Natsu Miyashita and it was translated by Philip Gabriel, who is a legend of Japanese translation. This is a book set in Hokkaido, and it's different to what you might expect because it's about pianos, it's about music, but it's not about a pianist, it's not about a musical prodigy, it's not about an orchestra or a band, it's about a guy who is working his way up as an apprentice to become a full-fledged piano tuner. He doesn't play piano, but he loves the mechanics of them. He finds the instrument beautiful, and he loves the act of tuning it. That's not something you ever see. If you're going to have a story about pianos, the protagonist will probably be a pianist. Not here. He's a tuner. And I think that's lovely. It's mostly about his relationships to the clients that he meets along the way, his mentor, his colleagues, and the way he slowly works himself up through the ranks and becomes a proper piano tuner. It's really, really charming. One of the greatest and most respected Japanese authors of all time is Junichiro Tanizaki, and this is the Makioka Sisters, which is what most people regard as his magnum opus. It's a pretty dense book, and it's very Jane Austen. It often gets compared to a lot of classic works of English literature, and I understand why. I just did it. This book is a family saga. It was written during World War II, and it's set during the years leading up to it. Our protagonists are a family, the Makioka family. They're a huge wealthy family spread out across Kansai. And of the 3 sisters in the title, 2 have already been married off, and the 3rd, the youngest sister, needs to get married, and that marriage needs to go well for the family's sake. This is a family drama, and it's a very beautiful and powerful one that has a lot to say about the changes that Japan was going through at the time in terms of modernization and westernization, old money versus new money, old society versus new society, the threat of war, etc., etc. Tanizaki was a beautiful man. He had a beautiful mind. He had a poet's soul, and he expressed that so wonderfully through his writing. This next one was one of my favorite books of last year, and it also happened to have been translated by one of my best friends, Arthur Ray-G. Morris. To this day, I am still so proud of Arthur for the incredible translation work that was put into this book. And this is Solo Dance by Lee Kotomi. As you might be able to tell from the name, Lee Kotomi was not born in Japan. She's Taiwanese, and she's been living in Japan for quite a while, and she actually wrote this book in Japanese. And then she translated it back into Mandarin herself. But Arthur has brought us the English translation, and this remains one of the most powerful things I've ever read. It's about queerness, and it's about depression, so just bear that in mind. If you struggle with depression and anxiety, this might be a tough read. I actually read it when I was in the deepest, darkest depths of depression, probably the darkest pit of depression I've ever been in, and it actually helped me. It felt very cathartic. I felt like I was being empathized with. But not everyone feels that. When they read something that is about depression, it might not have that effect, so keep that in mind. Solo Dance is very reflective of the author's own life. It is about a young lesbian who had a very rough time at university in Taiwan and ended up moving to Tokyo in her early 20s and has since lived in fear of being herself and exposing her truth to the world and just living honestly and comfortably in her own skin. She's frightened all the time, she has anxiety, and she does not feel good about her future. She's obsessed with thinking about death and reading books by authors who ended up taking their own lives. She's not in a good space, but this is a beautiful book. If you feel up to it, check it out. I am a massive fan of honkaku, the Japanese genre of murder mystery stories, and I only read this relatively recently. I'd never heard of Akimitsu Takagi before, and wow, he's amazing. The Tattoo Murder is a classic locked room murder mystery story, but it takes a long time to get going in a really satisfying way. You really get to know our protagonist, you get to know all the characters around him, and you get to know the murder victim for ages before she's finally killed off about a quarter of the way through the book. The victim is a woman who is heavily tattooed. Her father is a legendary tattoo artist, he has tattooed her back, and she has this gorgeous back piece that she shows off at tattoo conventions. And one day, she is killed in the bathroom of her own home. It is a locked room, no way in, no way out, the door is locked, and when her body is finally discovered, it has been mutilated, cut into pieces. Someone was after her tattoo. Earlier in the book, she reveals to our protagonist that someone had asked her if they could have the skin on her back after she dies. They want to keep her tattoo, and this person has done that before with other people's permission. Did he kill her? Did he get sick of waiting and take the tattoo for himself? Maybe. You'll have to read and find out. Another book that I reviewed and absolutely love is The Easy Life in Kamusari by Shion Miura. It was translated by Juliet Winters Carpenter, and it's a very simple book. It's about a young man from a big city who is kind of forced to move to a small, rural, isolated, mountainside location. And he hates it. He's a teenager, he doesn't want to be there. There's no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, and he hates it in this rural nowhere place. Until he gets to know the community, and he starts to like the work that they ask him to do, cutting down trees, maintaining the forest, becoming one with nature. It's a book about self-discovery, a story of a person getting to know themselves while finding an appreciation for small, quiet community life and a life connected to nature. It's lovely. Mild Vertigo by Mieko Kanai, translated by Polly Barton, is a tiny little, very deep and interesting literary novel. You can read it in a day, but you probably won't because it's short but dense. This is a book that just tells the story of a housewife. You follow her life. She's a very middle-class, comfortable Tokyo housewife. She has raised 2 sons. She's married to a guy who's very busy going off and doing his corporate life. She gossips with local people. She has a very stiff and regimented daily routine. And you get to know her. You live in her head for a few days, for a little while. It's a loosely feminist book about imbalances within gender dynamics when it comes to parenthood and work and home life, etc. But it's also a book that reminds you that every person contains multitudes. We are all unique and interesting in our own way. But it's also, as I said, very intensely literary, and there's a lot going on. There is a lot of stream of consciousness where one idea flows into another, a conversation flows into a thought, flows into another conversation. It all smushes together in a very intense way, and I really enjoyed it. The Boy and the Dog is a short and simple, beautiful novel by Seishu Hase, translated by Alison Watts, about the relationship between people and dogs. Man's best friend. It's the story of a dog that is separated from his owners by the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, and now he is moving through Japan from place to place, owner to owner, and every person who encounters him is massively affected by him in some way because that's the power of pets. That's the power of dogs. It's quite a sad and tragic tale in some ways, but it's also a beautiful and uplifting one. It'll make you cry for a variety of different reasons, and I encourage you to check it out. I do have a video on it. Most of the people watching this have probably seen Hayao Miyazaki's My Neighbor Totoro, and this is the novelization by Tsugiko Kubo. I read this like 10 years ago, and my partner read it just recently. Where did the sun go? What's the point in having a ring light? This was translated by Jim Hubbard, and for obvious reasons, it's a lovely book for kids. If you've got kids and they enjoy My Neighbor Totoro, this is the novelization. There's not much else to say. It's just the film as a book, but it's a lovely film and it makes for a lovely book. I can't remember if I talked about Izumi Suzuki in the last video, but she was an amazing writer of short stories. This collection was translated by multiple different translators, and it collects some amazing tales by her. Suzuki wrote a lot of strange and exciting and very punk stories that you can find in these collections: Terminal Boredom and Hit Parade of Tears. Her stories blend fairy tales, fantasy, science fiction, literary stuff, usually set in our world or an approximation of it. They are very punk, feminist, aggressively political tales about capitalism, patriarchy, and lots of other things that we should all always be angry about. Unfortunately, she didn't live a very long life. She took her own life decades ago when she was in her 30s. And what we have left are these incredible tales. If you haven't read her and you love punk, literary, strange, experimental things, check her out. Junji Ito is one of the great manga creators of all time and also one of the great masters of horror, and this book is really incredible. Not enough people talk about it. Censor is him doing full Lovecraft. This is a book about a cult and a book about a great, impossible to understand Lovecraftian thing. It is just Lovecraft. It is Junji Ito writing an original Lovecraftian tale, and he does it so well. It is twisted and uncomfortable and frightening. If you love Junji Ito, please check out Censor. If you love Lovecraft, racism aside, please check out Censor, because he has written so many great short stories and longer books, but Censor hit me in a pretty unique way, and I need more people to read it and talk about it. Idle Burning is a book that almost passed me by, and I'm so glad it didn't. This was written by Rin Usami, who is a very young and incredible writer. It was translated by Asa Yoneda, and the original Japanese won the Akutagawa Prize, which is a massive achievement. This is a book about idol culture. It's called Idle Burning. And it's also kind of about cancel culture and how much you can really trust and understand the people that you end up idolizing. It's about a young woman who is obsessed with idol culture. She runs a blog and she's kind of known online for writing about her favorite idol, but when the book begins, her favorite idol has just punched a female fan, and now he is in hot water. What does she do with that? How does she process that? How does she go on being a professional idol stan? How does she go on dedicating her life to this guy when he's done that? It's about the effects of idol culture on ordinary people, and it is something else. It's really short, it's really beautiful, and as someone who doesn't really understand idol culture, but I do have people that I look up to and idolize in my own way, I found it really interesting and compelling. Finally, we have Honeybees and Distant Thunder by Riku Onda, translated by Philip Gabriel, one of my favorite Japanese books of this year so far. I am totally amazed by this. It's a pretty hefty book about a music competition. It's about 3 piano prodigies that are all competing over the course of about a week in this massive international piano contest. We also follow the judges and a few other competitors, and it's just set over the course of a very short amount of time. But it's a book that is a dedication to classical music, to the beauty of the piano, and also to competition and how this competition means different things to different people. These characters are all very unique, and each one has a different reason for being there, a different reason to want to win, and different things that they're gonna get out of the competition after it's over. It's really, really gorgeous. It's also about their connections to each other, the friendships and bonds that they make, even though they are competing. I'm amazed by the beauty of this book, and if you're a music fan, especially a fan of classical music, you'll get so much out of this. This is Riku Onda celebrating what music gives to us in so many different and diverse ways. There you go, that was 20 must-read Japanese books. I love everything I've talked about here, and I will do this again because I'm always reading more great Japanese fiction. And once again, if you want to help me out, if you want to support me, if you want to tell me what videos I should make next, check out and join my Patreon. I would really, really appreciate it. And as always, subscribe for books.